Uh, can we record this, Dr. Brenda?
Yes, that's fine with me.
Thank you. So hello everyone. We have Dr. Brenda M. Rubenstein with us today. We're really honored to have her. Despite the fact that I messed up the timings, she was able to join us. So she is an assistant, a Joukowsky family assistant professor at the Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Dr. Brenda is also a Brown alumnus, which I was like very surprised because, it's really good to work at the place from where you studied. At least that's what I think about it. Uh, so she graduated from Brown University, and then she moved on to the University of Cambridge, where she studied under Dan Frankel. Is that right?
That's right. Dan Frankel and a few other people. Yep.
Yes, exactly. And she studied protein dynamics there. Afterwards, she moved to the Columbia University in New York City, where she studied under David Reifman, and she worked on quantum Monte Carlo methods. After she graduated, she went on to pursue 2 postdoctoral stints at 2 national labs at the very prestigious Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore. And she was the distinguished postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where she worked under a lot of people, including Miguel. I don't exactly remember his name, I'm sorry. Where she studied nonlinear dynamics, among other things. So we're really honored to have her here today, and she will tell us more about her work. So over to you, Dr. Brenda.
Sure. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you for the opportunity to come speak to you today. What I can absolutely tell you is it's much cooler here than in Pakistan right now, and so I'm probably happy being here right now. So it is summertime here, and it's about 20 degrees Celsius. So our summers are a little bit different. I think I'll choose our summers, but happy to come at some point. Actually, my father owns an engineering firm, and his business partner is Pakistani, so they cover a lot of the Middle East together, as well as the United States as their engineering firm. So today I wanted to give you a talk a little bit about my group. I've tried to make this kind of a friendly talk, mostly for students, but I'm very much happy to go into any research topic that you're interested in. My group overall is a theoretical / computational chemistry group, but we have very strong ties to both physics and biology. So sometimes people ask me, am I a chemist? Yes, I am a chemist, but I also feel very strongly as a physicist and a biologist as well. Overall, what my group tries to do is something like what this T-shirt says. So those people who know me know that I sometimes like to wear funny T-shirts. This T-shirt says higher, further, faster, more. My group likes to create methods, computational and theoretical methods, that allow you to push the bounds of what you can compute and what you can understand. So we like to create methods that are more accurate, that are faster, that can scale to much larger systems. And that's really the heart of a lot of the work that we do, even though you'll see that we work in many different directions. Before I go into those research areas, let me just say a little bit about where I'm from. I'm actually not in Providence right now. I'm in New Hampshire, but my university is in Providence, Rhode Island. So this is a picture of Providence, and I think chemists enjoy this picture because what we ironically do during the summer in Providence is we set our river on fire. Not that there's oil in the river, even though there is oil in some rivers in the US, that's not us. These are actually little fire pits that we put in the river, and this is called water fire. And so it's a famous aspect of our city of Providence. Providence is a city of about 1 million people, maybe up to 2 million people, depending upon how you count. But this is our downtown, which is maybe a couple blocks away from our university. If you're not familiar, so even though Providence is a smaller city, it is part of America's East Coast of cities. So you may be familiar with in the United States, there's a stretch from Washington, D.C. to Boston, which is our most populated stretch. We're right in the middle of that stretch. So Boston is about an hour away from us, assuming there's no traffic. Boston traffic is very well known. Maybe it's like Pakistan's traffic. It could take you 5 hours on a given day, but it's really only 40 minutes to an hour to get to Boston. And such institutions as MIT, Caltech, we're really in the education hub in the Boston area in Providence. And we're also about 3 hours away from New York. So I actually grew up in New York for most of my life. And so these are very easy bus rides back and forth. So we're right in that mix of American cities. Brown University is my university. It is an Ivy League institution, which means it's one of the oldest institutions in the United States. I forget our exact number, but Brown was founded before the United States of America was formed. So we're something like third or fourth oldest institution in the United States. And so this is the entrance to Brown. This building in the back is our original building in the 1700s that formed the core of the university. And when people enter Brown University each year, they enter through these gates. When they graduate, they're supposed to exit through the gates. Otherwise, the gates remain closed. And here's another look at Brown during the fall. So this is probably something that you don't get a lot of. So the fall is a very beautiful season where we come from in the United States. So that said, I want to go into some of the things that my research group does. So like I said, our key aim as part of my research group is to really make methods that are faster and more accurate. And the reason why we want to do that is what we want to do as chemical physicists is to be able to describe a variety of different real materials and devices. So I give two examples here of batteries and photovoltaics. These are devices that obviously we use in virtually all of our appliances every single day. And what you know, as well as anybody, is that we're constantly demanding that these devices perform better, that they're more energy efficient. In the case of batteries, that they have higher energy densities, shorter discharge times. In the case of photovoltaics, we're looking for photovoltaics that are cheaper, that are thinner, that can absorb more energy. And so we're constantly looking to improve these devices. But the thing is, it's not so easy to improve these devices. Years ago, people would say, all right, why don't we go into the lab and just experiment? So the way that we would try to create new devices is someone, maybe someone older who has more experience or maybe just a great idea would say, why don't we try this? Then you go into the lab and you'd vary it 100 times, 1,000 times, and you would see how you would optimize the properties of the given material that goes into the device. But the problem is that experimentation costs a lot of money. So if you think about it, every experiment, even simple experiments in US dollars, could be $50 to $1,000 per experiment. And that's not talking about people costs. So I always joke around with students, but experiments back years ago really meant, how many people can try how many different things. So that's many graduate students per idea. And so that's a huge cost overall. And that takes a lot out of one's ability to discover things. And so more recently, people have realized that a better path towards discovering materials is what we call computer-aided materials design. So the basic idea is that we use computers to quickly and cheaply sort through a variety of different possibilities before we ever go into the lab. So I'm saying computers here, but theory was sort of the way of doing this even before there were any computers. Using theory, you can try to eliminate possibilities. But now that we have computers, we can look at things that are even more specific, materials that are even more precise, and sift through them even faster in many different ways. Some of you might also recognize that now we also have an extra layer, which is machine learning and artificial intelligence that also helps build upon this platform. And so the idea is, instead of going into the lab, we're going to have computers or maybe artificial intelligence suggest to us what are the best possibilities for the device, the material that goes into the device that we want. And then we go in and we test the best candidates. And we can iterate on that process where you continually filter down the candidates through computation, then some experiment provides validation, and then you go in a circle until you're able to actually target the materials that you want. And this has accelerated things tremendously. If you think about the rate of scientific discovery over the past 20 years, when I was your age, as an undergraduate, a lot of this was just starting. And it's kind of staggering to see how fast things have developed over the past 20 years in terms of things that we can discover. And then once we discover them, how quickly we can understand and implement them. Now, not everything is a success story, but many things are, and it's kind of amazing to see that happening. So, you're right in the thick of an amazing modern day maelstrom of lots of interesting discoveries. Now, one thing about that paradigm is it kind of assumes that we can model everything that we want. And in some sense, we've made rapid increases in what we can in fact model, but I wouldn't say that we can model everything. So, to understand what I mean by this, we can go back to one of my, for example, postdoctoral advisors. So one of my postdoctoral advisors at Lawrence Livermore was someone named Bernie Alder, probably someone who could have won the Nobel Prize. He won the Presidential Medal of Science before he died. He was actually basically the first person, one of the first people to run what we call molecular dynamics simulations. So these are just, you put particles in a box and you let them move around. And so on the right, I show one of his initial simulations, which really started this field off in many regards, where he took 870 hard disks. So they're disks, they're two-dimensional because they couldn't even really do 3 dimensions back in that day. So they did 2 dimensions and they just watched what happened to these disks over time as they became liquid and the particles moved around. And so this is what we were talking about back in the 60s. He did a lot of his work on these IBM stretches, but in fact, he also came up with the brilliant idea of distributed computing, which I think many of you probably use now. He realized that a lot of scientific computing can be done in the gaps, in the spaces that are left over from much bigger calculations. And now I think we always use that paradigm in order to calculate the things that we need. But suffice it to say, what Bernie realized is that we could simulate things on computers, and in 1960, this is where we were at. Today, we can, of course, model much larger things. So this is Bernie's, I guess, modern day counterpart, Fred. Fred recently won the Gordon Bell Prize, which is the top prize for computing in the United States. And he did so by actually doing molecular dynamics of the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. So this is a long story, but in fluid dynamics, it's known that under certain situations, fluids will become unstable. Historically, people have modeled that not by using individual particles, but by actually looking at hydrodynamic equations. Fred literally modeled billions to trillions of particles using molecular dynamics. He did what Bernie did, but 62.5 billion particles to see this Kelvin-Helmholtz instability particle by particle, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. And so this shows how much our computational power has grown and why it makes this materials design paradigm successful and amazing. But what I should say is that we can't always use that paradigm for everything. And so my group takes a look at situations where we can push these paradigms in different directions. So we do a lot of different research, but I'll show you 3 main focus areas of my group to just give you a sense, and I'm happy to answer questions about anything else. So the first focus area is on what I'll call quantum statistical mechanics. So what we try to do there is we try to combine quantum mechanics with the statistical properties of molecules and also other particles to try to rapidly solve electronic structure problems. So why again would we want to do that? We want to do that because we want to be able to input into that materials design paradigm. We want to design batteries, we want to design photovoltaics, but to do that, you need to be able to solve the Schrodinger equation. And you have to do it for very big, complicated systems. And so what we try to do is we try to solve those big, complicated systems by using random numbers. So we try to solve the Schrodinger equation using random numbers. So I'll talk about that in a bit. We also do quantum statistical mechanics in the old-fashioned sense. So for those familiar, quantum statistical mechanics historically has referred to solving quantum properties at finite temperature. So we also do that. We've developed a lot of the first theories for doing that in the modern day, and I'll give you a sense of that. A second area that we look at is alternative computing. Some of that is quantum and molecular computing, but we also do biological computing. What we mean by that is we want to think about, well, we have these big processors, like I just showed, but could we compute using other things? And the reason why I'd want to compute using other things is because those processors that we currently have work under only certain conditions and are incredibly, incredibly energy hungry. Some of the computers that I just showed require their own power plants to run. And you can ask the question, is it fair to be running a massive computer that uses the power of an entire city, let's say in Pakistan, and maybe in Pakistan, that city doesn't have a power plant, right? So we're using power plants just for computers to do science. Could we do something better? And so we have been trying to understand, could we compute using molecules, which would require very little energy? How should we compute quantum mechanically? And also, could we actually understand how biology computes? So a lot of times when people think about computing in biology, they think about the neurons in your brain. But actually, your cells can compute. And so we've been working on theories, or how do you get cells to compute and colonies of bacteria to compute? And the last focus area that I'll mention here today is we also use a lot of statistical physics to try to understand how proteins evolve. And I'll be clear, we've been doing this way before COVID. I think now everybody understands why you want to be able to predict how proteins evolve. You get a whole bunch of mutations. You want to understand how you drug those mutations and in which direction things are evolving. But we started this a long time ago, and one of the questions we asked is could we predict evolution based on just thermodynamic properties of proteins? It turns out the thermodynamic properties are, how does the protein fold? How well does it bind? How well does it catalyze different things? So we tried to understand those properties and see how well they predict evolution for a number of different proteins. It turns out a lot of those properties are useful, but it doesn't give you the full picture. So I'll go into each of these focus areas in a second. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm assuming not, but please let me know if there are any questions. I'm happy to go through. So I'm going to start on the first focus area, which is quantum statistical mechanics. It's probably the closest to chemical physics of the other areas, at least traditional chemical physics. So one of the methods we've been working on a great deal is something called auxiliary field quantum Monte Carlo. So first of all, what is quantum Monte Carlo? As I was explaining before, what we oftentimes want to do is we want to solve the Schrodinger equation using random numbers. And techniques that do that are called quantum Monte Carlo techniques. So they solve for some quantum property using a whole bunch of random numbers. And one such technique, which I helped develop, is called auxiliary field quantum Monte Carlo. So what this technique does is, let's say it takes in a molecule or a material, and from that molecule and material, it tries to sample all of the possible wave functions that can describe that material. So it starts out with what we call a mean field Hamiltonian and a mean field wave function. That's that black dot in the center. And then it uses random numbers to try to sample and generate other wave functions that may represent that material or that molecule. So you see here, these are called random walks, and these are random walks in the space of possible wave functions that can describe the molecule and material. So there are a lot of details about how do you go from molecule to those random walks. I'm happy to walk you through them at some point, but suffice it to say, why am I interested in such a thing? So these methods are very fast because of the random numbers, comparatively fast because of the random numbers, but they're also incredibly accurate. That's really their selling point. They have this very high level of accuracy that is very hard to achieve using any other method. So on the right, I show just an example from some of our recent work where we're trying to understand what the binding energy is of an electron to what we call a dipole bound anion. So these dipole bound anions, you can see a little molecule here that's I believe that's CH3CN. That little molecule has a dipole moment. And based on that dipole moment, it can capture an electron very, very, very far away from its center. So usually in chemistry, you're used to electrons being valence bound. So they're the valence shells of different atoms. These dipoles, and this was predicted by Teller in 1950, Teller realized that if you have a dipole, just a dipole, not a charge, just a dipole as your molecule, it could bind an electron very, very far away. So this is something like 10 angstroms away. That's why you see this huge orbital. What you can imagine is if that electron is bound very, very far away, it's also very weakly bound to that molecule. And so the energy of that binding is going to be quite small. And so our methods are actually able to capture this right on. So if we use our stochastic methods in just I'll say the standard random sense, that's what I call uncorrelated here, you see that we get a bunch of random answers. I mean, they're not entirely random. They have randomness in them, but these answers fluctuate around the energy that we would expect. If we use some tricks, which I'll call correlated sampling, I'm happy to go into details, but if we use some tricks, still use that randomness, you see we get the blue line and we're basically right on what that energy should be. So we're able to predict these incredibly weak binding energies with sub-millihartree accuracy and very, very, very small approximations, and sometimes no approximations whatsoever. So that's why we're interested in these methods. These methods work for molecules, but they also work for solids and other things. So let me go into one area which I briefly mentioned. It seems to be slow. Okay. Now, one thing that we can do with this, we can absolutely look at ground state wave functions, ground state properties, binding energies, et cetera. But what we can also do is we can think about what happens at finite temperature. And so this is really an area that my group was, in some sense, pioneering in the modern age. There were people who did things years ago, but they weren't as accurate and specific. So what we can do is we can try to predict how electrons will behave at higher temperatures. And you might say, why would we care about electrons at higher temperatures, not just in the ground state? And so that's because if you look at a variety of different systems, if you look at things in geophysics and astrophysics at the center of planets and stars, there are many electrons, and most of those electrons are at very high temperatures. They're also at very high pressures. And so because they're at high temperatures and high pressures, you actually need a very good theory to describe them. So these are what we call hot electrons because they're literally hot. They're in the middle of stars. You'd also care about these kinds of high temperature electrons if you're looking at laser driven chemistry or physics. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but there's a growing area where you use lasers to control reactions and direct them in different ways. And so in those situations, the electrons are also quite warm. And most importantly for me, you're interested in hot electrons because a lot of times when you want to think about the phase diagrams of materials, the different phases that you see occur at different temperatures. So this is a phase diagram of temperature versus doping. This is for cupric oxide for a superconductor, which is a very hard case. But lots of materials have phase diagrams like this, where you have antiferromagnetic behavior, metallic behavior, et cetera. You might want to be able to predict at what temperatures you see those different behaviors occur. And so what we've done is we've developed methods that use this auxiliary field quantum Monte Carlo at high temperatures to be able to predict what happens with temperature for different systems. So to give you a sense, here's a benchmark example. We just do this for water. Again, it's a benchmark. Water as one molecule at high temperatures doesn't quite make sense, right? You need a whole system to really be at high temperatures, et cetera. But you can certainly benchmark it on something like water. And what we plot is the energy versus 1 over the temperature. So 0 here means a high temperature. The large numbers on the x-axis mean a low temperature. temperature. And what we can do is we can trace out what happens to the energy as we decrease the temperature to the ground state. So you see at high temperatures, we have a number of different methods that can predict the same energy. So ED is the exact result in red. Our results are in green, and then mean field theories, which are the simplest theories, are in blue. So all these theories agree basically at high temperature. At high temperature, the electrons are essentially not interacting with each other, so it's pretty easy to predict what's going on. It also turns out to be pretty easy to predict what happens at lower temperatures. So if you go out to 35 on my plot, you see that all the dots also align there. And that's because there aren't that many states. But it is difficult to predict what happens at these intermediate temperatures. So when there happens to be a phase transition where some electrons are going to higher level states, others are not, that's difficult to predict. And so you see these theories disagree in this intermediate temperature regime. I mean, field theory is very off, but our methods are basically on top of the exact if you include their error bars. And so we were able to develop this theory that can give us results very close to the exact results in these important regimes. So you might say, okay, water, that's not the greatest example. It's a benchmark. Why would we really want to do this? And this segues into some of our current work. So we really want to understand phase diagrams, as I was mentioning, temperature versus some parameter, how is that going to change in the system? And so one example we did on this recently was looking at hydrogen chains. This is, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but like hydrogen chains are a playground for a lot of theoretical chemistry because hydrogen should be simple. You shouldn't need to use an incredibly complex theory for hydrogen. But these chains have interesting behavior. As you stretch them, you get different phases. So they can be metallic, they can be ferromagnetic, they can have different types of phases as you stretch them. So people have explored this in the ground state quite extensively. You're really the first people to do it at finite temperature and see what you get. And these chains are very much like models used in physics. So if any of you are familiar with the Hubbard model, you can think of these chains as like an approximation to the Hubbard model, or maybe I should say it the opposite way. So the Hubbard model is an approximation to these kinds of chains, but these chains have longer range interaction. So hydrogens can interact with each other over much longer distances in principle. And so we wanted to study this, see what happens, what our theory predicts. And so first of all, what we see, I'll just point out, is as you might expect, as you increase the distance between your hydrogens, so you stretch your chain, you go down this column here, what you see is that as you increase that distance, the ability for the electrons to hop from hydrogen to hydrogen goes down. So this T effective goes down. But the interaction on each site, so the energy it takes for electrons to be on the same side is going to increase. So this is a signature, very clear signature that you're entering into an insulating regime when these things happen. You're not going to be a metal if your hopping is very, very small. And so that's kind of expected. We can measure that out. We can see exactly what's going on. We can understand how much the Hubbard model approximates our chains or vice versa. But what's more interesting is we can see a few things about the phases. That's good. Okay, so what we can do is we can take a look at when do these chains become metals? When do they become insulators? So on the right, I show some plots of what we call the double occupancy. This is a measure of how many electrons are on the same atom at the same time. And if a lot of electrons are on the same atom at the same time, that's very, very improbable, and also implies that you don't have very strong interactions on that atom. So if the double occupancy is 0.25, that means you're a perfect metal, because that means you have an equal probability of electrons being up on every side and electrons being down on every side, if you're at half, what we call half filling. So if you have half up, half down electrons, the probability that they're in the same place is a half times a half, which is 0.25. So if these chains are metallic, they are going to have this double occupancy of 0.25. But if they're insulating, then their occupancy is going to go down. So we see a few things from these plots. So on the left are the plots from our results, AFQ and C. which is a correlated theory, should be close to exact in some sense. What we see is, first of all, at high temperatures, so where this KBT is 10, that's a high temperature, everything's metallic. That's what you would expect. High temperatures, the electrons can move all around, things are going to be metallic. But as you go to lower temperatures, you see that for different bond lengths, so if that bond is 0.5 angstroms, 0.75 angstroms, et cetera, for different bond lengths, you're going to see that an insulator arise. So at the shortest bond length, where the atoms are very close together, you still remain metallic at low temperatures. But at the longer bond lengths where you stretch it out, you become an insulator. And we see that exactly in our theory. What we also see, and you might have been able to pick out, is some of these lines sort of go down and then they go up, which is actually unusual. Sometimes you would expect to see that these just go down as you go to lower temperatures. They go down and up. And so this is a very, very special effect called the Pomerantchuk effect, which has to do with entropy accounting. And so in some of these situations, you actually see the double occupancy reach a minimum and then come back up again. So that was an interesting thing to see that's never been seen in these chains. What I should also say is if you compare our results, the left panel to the right, our results are close to exact. The right panel is what happens if you use mean field theory. So these are theories that don't account for multiple electrons at the same time in some sense. If you ever heard of density functional theory, that's a flavor of mean field theory. And like density functional theory, these mean field theories predict that things are usually metallic. So density functional theory is known to predict things to be more metallic than it should be for most functionals. And so we see that exactly in our hydrogen chains as well. So compared to our more exact results, it tends to overpredict what's metallic, and then sometimes it totally overshoots how insulating other things are. So you see the contrast in where our method is actually giving us details that we wouldn't see otherwise. What we can also do are things we can basically do real thermodynamics on our system. So we can also develop theories that allow us to measure things like heat capacities and entropies. In fact, our group is working on some very nice papers about entropy and entanglement measures with these theories right now. But suffice to say, we can look at specific heats. And the specific heats tell us a lot about the kinds of excitations in our system. So do we have charge excitations where charges are fluctuating? Do we have spin excitations where spins are fluctuating? And we can compare what we see in our hydrogen chains to what we see in the Hubbard model, the 1D Hubbard model. And so on the right, you see predictions from many, many years ago for the 1D Hubbard model. These were actually mostly analytical predictions. You can see the people drew the curves back then, which is kind of amazing to me. I don't draw curves in my papers, but they drew the curves here, and they see charge and spin excitations in their Hubbard model chains. If we go to similar parameter regimes, what you can see is that we see the charge excitation, so these big humps, but we never see the spin excitations, no matter what temperature, what bond distance we go to. And that is because in these hydrogen chains, the charges and the spins are interrelated in ways that are not quite true in the Hubbard model, or at least that's one reason why we suspect that we see this, and we're trying to understand this better now. And so using our theories, we can actually go in and we can see more precise things about what's happening in these systems. Let me give you another example of these theories, which are ground state examples. That was finite temperature. That's a relatively young field, I would say. I mean, it has old roots, but there are younger developments recently. Let me show you ground state. So a lot of people care about, what happens in the ground state? Can we use these methods for ground state? And the answer is absolutely. We can absolutely use these quantum Monte Carlo methods in the ground state. And so one set of systems we've gotten really interested in recently are 2D materials, which many of you have probably heard of. So the simplest 2D material is graphene, or at least the first discovered 2D material is graphene. And you might remember the Scotch tape experiments for graphene. But there are a lot of different 2D materials that have since been discovered and shown to be important. And these materials are special because they have interesting electronic features. So they have interesting topologies. They undergo interesting transitions when you stretch them, crinkle them. And what's also interesting in particular is that you can stack them together. So each of these layers has its own properties, but when you stack them, you can form these heterostructures that are almost like designer materials. I compare them to Legos, Lego blocks that you can stack on top of each other to make something that you never expected from before. And so we got really interested in these because our methods are very, very accurate. And it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with these heterostructures when you stack these materials together. It's also very hard to characterize these monolayer materials. They are very thin, and so it can be hard to stick these in different spectrometers and see what's going on. There are ways of doing it, but your options are a little bit more limited. You have to be a little bit more clever. And so we wanted to take a look at these materials. And so one that we decided to take a specific look at, for example, is something called chromium triiodide. This was the first single monolayer magnet ever discovered. And so what's going on here is that the chromium obviously has electrons that will give it spin, that will endow the material with magnetism without a field. So under certain conditions, this will be a ferromagnet most of the time, but with certain layers, if you layer these materials, they'll go from single layer as ferromagnetic to antiferromagnetic if there are 2 layers, to ferromagnetic again if there are 3 layers. And so what one might want to understand is where is this magnetism coming from? How does it flip when you stack the layers? How does this magnetism change? How does it flip? It's a very interesting topic. Another thing that I'll just say is that if you remember those mean field theories I was talking about, density functional theory. So for this material, those theories all said that the chromium should have a spin of 3 on it. And that was the previous prediction. So let me just say what we find is that that's not the case once you actually account for the correlation among all the different electrons. So when we use our sophisticated methods, these quantum Monte Carlo methods, the one we're using here is called DMC, diffusion Monte Carlo. There's slight differences with AFQMC. What we see is that these moments are actually something like 3.6, much larger. And we also see that actually the iodines in this chromium triiodide have moments too. And so yes, the correct answer is that if you look at all the chromiums and iodides in its unit cell, it's going to have a moment of 3. But if you just look at the chromiums do not have a moment of 3. They actually have a larger moment, and the iodines have a negative moment. And so this is a picture that people have been seen before. What I should also say I didn't highlight on this is that we actually developed new techniques in order to get the right geometry for these materials. These materials are very sensitive to stretching. They're just 2D, so they can stretch really readily. And so we created new methods to find that at a high level of accuracy. In using our methods, we plugged our structure, the structure we found, into DFT, and we were able to get high moments once we did that. So there was a huge issue with the geometries people were using. And interestingly, when we were finding this geometry, we had no idea there was an experimental group out there that was actually going in with STM and measuring that geometry. And when they published our results within a few months of ours, we had exactly the same results for what that geometry should be. And so that was sort of a validation of how accurate our method is. What I'll also say is we did explore things like spin orbit coupling, spin lattice coupling, spin phonon coupling. This material also has very strong coupling to its underlying lattice and phonons. So that's an example of some of the methods that we're using. We're making these methods so that they can be fast, they can do solids, they can look at things with an incredibly high accuracy that other methods cannot. So we can really resolve the small differences in what's happening in different materials. So for the sake of time, maybe I'll go through one more section with you, and then I can talk just a little bit about Brown's program if you're interested, and happy to answer questions also about emissions in the United States and so forth. So maybe I'll also talk about focus 2, which is alternative computing, quantum and molecular computing. What I'm going to focus on is our molecular computing. So what we've been trying to do, which is a little bit different, it almost turns theoretical chemistry on its head is in theoretical chemistry, computational chemistry, what we usually do is we use computers to model molecules. But what we wanted to do here is use molecules to compute. So it's kind of the opposite, go in the opposite direction, do the opposite thing. And so what we've been trying to do is store information in molecules and then compute using those different molecules in, you can imagine a test tube. So we have a whole bunch of molecules in solution. We want to make them compute. How could we do that? And you might say, why would a theorist be doing this? Because there's no theory here. There's nothing at all. It's kind of amazing to me. I never realized this before going into this field. But when people decided that digital computers were the way to go, von Neumann architectures were the way to go, and roughly the 60s or so, there was no theory that continued to be developed on what we call analog systems, that have continuous values of bits and information. And so there's basically no theory out there for analog computation, molecular computation, biocomputation, even quantum computation, which is amazing. It's just a 70, 60-year gap of people not caring about anything that isn't a digital architecture. Very few people. And so there's very little theory there, and that's where theorists came in. So what we wanted to do is see, first of all, could we store a large amount of information in molecules? So interestingly, people have been trying to store a lot of information in DNA, and that kind of makes sense. DNA stores your genetic information. So you can store information in DNA. Maybe you've heard of these examples of caveman being frozen, and then we're able to get their genetic signatures back. Maybe we could recreate those cavemen or recreate dinosaurs or whatnot if it's Jurassic Park, right? So your DNA stores your information, and people have been using DNA to try to do that. But what we wanted to do is, could we use small molecules, not polymers, to store information for us? And the basic idea that I came up with is the way that we can do this is through the presence or absence of a molecule in a mixture. So as many of you know, bits, information is stored in bits, zeros and ones. And so if you want to store a bit stream, you have to be able to store a bunch of zeros and ones. And what we can do is we can assign a molecule to each of these bits and say, if the molecule is in the solution, that's a 1. If the molecule is not in the solution, that's a 0. So that's the simplest way of thinking about it. Of course, there are more complex ways of mapping the information that make it more dense, but that's the most basic way. And so we can make mixtures of what's present or absent to store our information. This is a really hard task, I'll emphasize, because you have to have a lot of molecules. You have to be able to exactly make those molecules and put them in the flask. You can't have a mistake molecule. That's a problem with information. A lot of times we can deal with mistakes, but not with information storage. If you have too many mistakes, you can't find your message, get the completely wrong answer, right? So you have to find ways of exactly writing these things. So if you write those things down, and the writing is basically storing the molecules in a flask, at some point you're going to want to read that information out. And so the way to read that information out is using different types of chemical analysis. And you can think about what might work here. What we settled upon is if we want to store large amounts of information, we have to use basically mass spectrometry. So I know many of you may have used NMR in your classes or maybe done some sequencing of some sort. But mass spectrometry lets you read out large numbers of molecules relatively quickly. And it tends not to care about exactly what the molecule looks like. So if you want to use a large diversity of different molecules, MS can read a lot of them. So we came up with a way to synthesize the molecules to make these mixtures and store info, and then to read out that information using MS. And again, reading things out is also very difficult because you have to be able to exactly read out the bits. You can't make mistakes when you're doing information storage, or at least you can't make that many. You have to be able to correct everything. So doing that, we decided to use Ugi molecules. So these are molecules that are produced by an Ugi reaction. They consist of 4 components to make these complex molecules. And these different molecules, what's nice about them is you can combine them in different ways. They're like pieces you could put together in different ways. So you can make many molecules from a few pieces. And so we wrote our information into these molecules, and we store things like Picasso's violin. We can store anything. My colleagues, the engineers, were mostly in charge of making the images, and so they chose like a lot of different images that were like classical Egyptian images, which is great. But we were aiming for something more excited. So we moved up to Picasso's violin. Still do more, but Picasso's violin is basically over 1 million bits. And so we were able to store over 1 megabyte of data for this and read that out with relatively high accuracy. And so we were able to demonstrate this for small molecules. Our work was some of the first work to store information in non-genomic molecules. So genomic meaning DNA or RNA. So these red dots here on this graph on the right are genomic demonstrations, which have gone up to 1 gigabyte of information to store in molecules. And you can see that in relatively short order, we were able to make these mixtures to store over megabytes of data. And now we have a startup company that's working on increasing this capacity much further to gigabytes and hopefully terabytes of information. Let me tell you one more quick story about the computation aspects of this project. So that was storage. And our venture is mostly working on cold storage, but also information storage on materials so that you can label the materials very discreetly. You can use small molecules to tell you where the material came from, where it's going. So that's a whole cutting edge area of business I'm happy to talk about. But one other area that we wanted to go into is how do we compute using these things? They have so much information. How do you do computation? And so what I realized at the beginning of the project is maybe that we can do machine learning. So machine learning, one of the most basic units of machine learning is the perceptron. So I guess this was made a professor at Cornell back in the 1950s. A perceptron is what we call a binary linear classifier. So what it does is it decides whether certain data sets or images belong to one class or another class. It picks between two classes. So maybe you feed it cats and dogs, and it decides whether the image is a dog or a cat. So if it is a clear cat, it will get cat. If it's clear dog, it will get dog. But then it has to make a decision. If you give it, I guess this is wolf, is that a cat or a dog? And so it will classify and choose which one it is, and it's linear because it forms a linear boundary. So this perceptron is a basic unit of a lot of machine learning algorithms. And mathematically, what it does is it takes in a bunch of inputs, xi, and then it weights them with different weights according to their importance, sums up the product of those weights and inputs. So that's this z function up here, and it might add a bias b. And then it thresholds that sum. So depending upon what the threshold of that sum is, so if the z is bigger than a certain threshold or smaller, then it classifies things as cat or dog, one class or the other. So what I realized is that chemistry actually does this z operation here all the time. So we'd call this weight times xi, so this weighting of inputs. That's basically what happens during mixing. When you take volumes of different substances, those are weights. And when you mix them together, you automatically get a product of the weight and the identity of what you're mixing together chemically. You also get weights if you have different reactions that run at different rates. So like if one reaction runs faster than another, that can also be considered as a kinetic weight, for example. So chemistry automatically does this z function. It turns out what we realize is that chemistry also does this threshold function automatically if you choose very specific reactions to do that. And so what we were able to do is we were able to perform a machine learning algorithm on chemistry. And one of the simplest examples we use to do that is something called a volumetric perceptron. So we said our weights are volumes of different substances. And what we did is we took a whole bunch of images. We encoded the images in different types of molecules. So maybe image one is in encoded in molecule 1, image 2 is encoded in molecule 2, and so on and so forth. You can plate all those images together. So these were a bunch of numbers we plated together. We can put them all together at the same time. We can then train a machine learning algorithm to give us weights. And then those weights tell us the volumes we should take from each of these different little wells. And we can pull all those weights from these different wells and then threshold them. And that tells us what image we saw. And so we can recognize all these images all at once through this algorithm. And in fact, we were able to classify all these images all at the same time in parallel with over 96% accuracy. Now, the thing about this in this original demonstration is that we moved the fluids together and we thresholded them using a computer. That's kind of cheating. So the information was in the molecules, but we used a computer to determine the threshold. What I spent maybe a year of my life banging my head on is how would we get to do that threshold chemically? And what I've since realized is one way of doing this is using what we call autocatalytic reactions. So these are reactions that speed up. So when more product is being made. So autocatalytic reactions are reactions that catalyze themselves. So they produce a product. So here's an example autocatalytic reaction. It produces this product, this trisamine product, that catalyzes its own reaction. So what that means is that when there's a lot of product, eventually the amount of this reaction is going to plateau at a high level. But if there isn't that much product, it's going to be at a low level. And that's a threshold. That's exactly a threshold. That's what we use in machine learning all the time. That's a sigmoid function. You basically say some concentration is low, some concentration corresponds to high, and you get your two classes. And so you can actually use this in an experiment, and I think we're working on finishing up a follow-up paper on this right now, where you can take an image like this is an anchor. I guess we're from Rhode Island, so Rhode Island is a state by the sea, so we have a lot of anchors. And you can recognize this anchor by plating a whole bunch of this catalyst, which is the blue. And then we can try to recognize that this is an anchor image over some other image, dog, cat, pony, by training our neural network and then just seeing how fast the autocatalytic reaction finishes. So when the autocatalytic reaction finishes fastest, that means that you've classified the image correctly. So you can figure out what this image is if you've trained networks to be able to determine what that image is in the first place. So these are just some examples of computing. What I'll tell you is that this is a very challenging area. So, so far, I haven't talked about any of the theory underlying this. This is just a lot of, thinking about what could work, what could not work. That's not a theory. And so currently we're spending a lot of time thinking about what is the theory? What would tell us which reactions would accomplish certain functions and what can be accomplished? And so far that nobody knows the answers to that. All right, so for the sake of time, I'll probably skip over focus 3, but I'm happy to take any questions. A couple things that I'll just say for the students in the audience. So what I like to think my group does is we make a lot of new theories, come up with a lot of new ways of doing things that are faster and more efficient. And we do this in a lot of different areas of theory. So there's a lot of quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, many body theory, also computing theory that's involved. We like to apply this to things. So once we make our theories, we try to apply it to real materials, real problems. We usually work with experimentalists to do this. And we work at the interface of many different fields. So a lot of people, some people in my group are physicists, some people in my group are chemists, some people in my group are chemical engineers, some people in my group are mathematicians. I didn't go into the hardcore theory today, but we do that too. And so there are a lot of different disciplines that come together to do this. So we do use a lot of computing and math and thinking. That's kind of what we do every day. But we don't do this all the time. I guess the way we like to think about work is, you should be serious about your work, but you do it when you're productive, I have an old story when I was in graduate school, and this picture on the left is someone I used to go to grad school with. And he would work all night, but he would sleep all day under his desk on Don Frankel's book, actually. And so, yeah, you could do it, but the point is to be smart, to be productive, to do work, to work hard, but to work effectively. You don't have to work all the time to get things done. So well, I'll put a word in about Brown in case you're interested. Like I said, Brown is an Ivy League university in the United States. Our program, so in the chemistry department, we consist of about 25 active research faculty that cover all disciplines of chemistry. Our physics department is also right across the street. And there are about 10 condensed matter physicists in the physics department. That's just condensed matter. We cover all areas, like I said. We're also, I would say, increasingly young. So we hired 4 new faculty last year. I just released an ad for a new professor of theoretical chemistry that we expect to hire this year. So we're growing, and we have a lot of younger faculty. Our program consists of about 100 students over 5 years. So we take about 20 applicants per year in all fields. And our PhD program takes about 5 years to complete a PhD. So we're pretty serious. Unlike some programs, we're pretty serious about 5 years. People generally don't graduate earlier. And we definitely don't keep people longer than 6 years. So people generally graduate in about 5 years. Our salary is about $40K per year plus benefits. So we have medical benefits are paid for, and dental benefits are paid for, and things like that. This is a pretty nice salary for where Providence is. So Providence is in that East Coast strip of the US, but we're probably the cheapest city on that strip. So, there are students that buy houses. I was looking for a house, and there were students that were buying houses instead of me. So, people have a pretty good life there. A couple of unique facets about our program. The way I like to put it is we're big enough to have what you need, but we're also small enough so that everybody knows each other and you get pretty close advising. So we do not have 100 people groups. That's not a thing. Actually, my group's probably one of the bigger ones. So you get pretty close advising. Everybody is pushed to succeed. So we're really not in the mindset of trying to fail people out. It's pretty rare that anybody fails out if they're trying. We have clear strengths. What are our strongest areas? Computation, spectroscopy, nanomaterials, and nanocharacterization. So kind of physical chemistry, chemical physics. You may know that Brown is the home to Onsager. So long story, but Onsager did most of his famous Nobel Prize winning work when he was a professor at Brown. Turned out, as everybody has told me who knew him, nobody could understand him. His accent, his speaking was impossible. So Brown did not give him tenure, but he did all of his work while he was at Brown. So we do have a number of award-winning chemists in our department, particularly in spectroscopy and in theory. One other thing that's unique about our program, we have something called the Open Graduate Program. So this is a program where you can get your master's at the same time as your PhD, the master's in a different field. So you can always get your master's in the same field with your PhD, but we let you get a master's in a different field. So a lot of my students will get a master's in computer science because it's good for jobs these days, or physics or math, in addition to their chemistry PhD. So I'm just pointing to one student, Ching Yu, who did his master's actually in business at the same time as chemistry, and now he's working in industry. So that's our program. I won't belabor this. I'm on the admissions committee. I'm happy to talk to you about what makes a good application in the United States versus a not good application. We don't have tests. US has moved away from tests. We can go on a whole long story about that. We don't have people take tests to get in. Personal statements, almost everything in recommendation letters if you want to get into a US institution these days. But I can talk about that if anybody has questions. So not to make this too long, thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions on anything. I just want to quickly acknowledge my group. So this is some of my group. We have electronic structure, like I said, molecular computing, biophysics. There's a picture of my group during the fall. So this past fall, once things opened up for COVID. As you can see, I encourage people to join from many different places across the globe and many different parts of the United States. So we have a pretty diverse group. And I would also like to acknowledge my funding. So these are some of my funding agencies. I'm very blessed to receive their support. So that I'm happy to take any questions about the science or any other aspect of things.
Thank you, Dr. Brenda. The talk was really engaging, and I must tell you that you're a great storyteller.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I have a few questions too, but there are some questions. Itiza has a question. Itiza, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, hello, am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned something about quantum Monte Carlo and how it basically involves a mapping from your unknown quantum system to your Fock space, where you are measuring deviations from the mean Hamiltonian or the mean quantum state.
Yes.
So the question I had was that how do you actually determine the mean Hamiltonian? Because from my understanding from quantum mechanics, that kind of assumes that you already have an idea of what your Hamiltonian or what your quantum state should look like.
Okay, yeah. So when we describe a quantum system, we usually write down that it's Hamiltonian. So the Hamiltonian, you can write down in different ways. So the simplest way of writing down the Hamiltonian is as a mean field Hamiltonian. What that means is that we assume that electrons interact with only a mean field, an average of all of the other electrons. And you explicitly write that into your Hamiltonian. So the Hamiltonian part you have full control over. You can write down different Hamiltonians for all of your different systems. So you have choice there. You know what it is, and you can write it at different levels. So you pick a mean field Hamiltonian and you write out that Hamiltonian, and then you solve the Schrodinger equation for that. So in our case, when we describe molecules and materials, we're usually using, well, for molecules, we're usually using a Hartree-Fock mean field solution. For materials, we're usually using a density functional theory mean field solution as our starting point.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the mean Hamiltonian is just the effective Hamiltonian, i.e. the interactions of all the electrons with your atom, essentially, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Right. So mean field means we take one electron and we assume that it interacts with an average of all the other electrons. So we don't
Yes, perfect, I got it.
Yeah. So what we don't say is electron 1 interacts with 2 and 3 and 4. We say average of the others. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. That is all I wanted to understand now. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Brenda, for that. I think there are no more questions from the audience. I have a few questions.
Sure.
So have you applied these multi-electron methods that you were talking about to systems like borofene or maybe twisted bilayer graphene? Because their behavior is something that is, not normal in a sense.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
how much success did you have if you have applied those to this system?
Yeah. So this is a great question. Actually, the discoverer of borofene is in the office right next door to me.
Yes, I know, Professor Wang. I know about Professor Wang.
Okay. Yeah. So we've discussed this. Yeah. So there are a lot of mysteries in borofene. The answer for you is we haven't applied it to borofene, but I agree that that is an interesting system and we've thought about it. Graphene, we are currently in the process. So we can do, if you just want one sheet of graphene, no problem. What is challenging for us is when you want to make the twisted heterostructures that you're talking about. So the twisted heterostructures, usually they have their interesting physics at very specific angles of their twist. And usually those angles are small angles. So, we're talking about basically 1 degree for graphene. That 1 degree means that we have to have a very large system size to do our calculations right. And so the methods I described would not be able to directly do that large system, but we are currently working on other random number based methods that can absolutely do that. So we have to be smarter to be able to do these much bigger twist systems. And so that's absolutely an active area of research in my group right now.
Because it would be great to have some sort of predictable behavior about these systems because they have amazing properties.
Absolutely.
Second question that I have is you were talking about sigmoid functions, right?
Yes.
Are they similar to cost functions?
cost functions. So do you mean cost functions in terms of when you train your neural networks?
Yes, exactly.
So the sigmoid functions are for thresholding answers to go through your neural network. So I guess what I would say is usually your loss or your cost function comes at the end after you. So usually when you construct a neural network, you have a bunch of sigmoid functions in the middle at each of your nodes. And then when your nodes output, they give you answers that one can put in the loss function. So they're not directly, but they feed into that loss function. Maybe is the way to think about it.
So one takes output of the output of one as an input. I get it.
Yeah.
And I know about Onsager, by the way. I know about his reciprocal relations, and I also know that nobody understood him. I wrote read this story somewhere. Thank you for the wonderful talk. And one question that I have, it's a very lofty goal, but I'm very much interested in, using computation and machine learning and these methods in systems like the conditions that were on prebiotic Earth, just like Harold Urey experiment. What are the origins of chirality? So my question is, can we rediscover chirality using machine learning and then maybe trace back engineer the steps to see, how did the system do it?
Yeah. So the whole question boils down to, do we actually have enough information to do that? So the machine learning is not necessarily going to help you unless you have enough information to do that. But I agree with you about can we use it in those regards. So in fact, our group is trying to understand, the origins of autocatalysis and how do we get to modern chemical reaction networks from it, which would tell us about the origins of life. What is challenging is one has to search through large reaction spaces, and honestly, people haven't always supplied the data that's needed to do that. And so that's a lot of the challenge. But in principle, it should be doable given sufficient data.
All right, because this is the question that really bothers me.
Right.
It is a very, very interesting question.
Right. The other issue with that question is you can also come up with a number of mechanisms, but that doesn't mean that you can prove that those happened. So
yes,
that's the other problem.
Yes. So do we have more? I think we are out of questions, I guess. I am certainly not, but that's okay. So thank you for your wonderful talk. I really, I'm grateful that you could attend despite the fact that, the timing issues and everything. So we're really grateful that you were able to attend.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So this is, I guess, where we say bye.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Stay in touch with you. All right.
Have
Bye.
a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.